Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now, I'm delighted to be joined again today by Adam Ibrahim, the Chief Executive Officer of one of the world's leading providers of financial products, the UK-based Oasis Crescent. We last met in the autumn of 2016, post-Brexit and the election of a new UK Prime Minister, Theresa May. At that moment, he made the point that whilst the result of the Brexit referendum hadn't been initially expected, he was optimistic that nerves had been calmed and that the markets were recovering from the initial jitters which saw over $110 billion wiped off share prices. We've seen a controversial US election, with Donald Trump finally occupying the White House, which most will probably acknowledge was again something of a surprise, with major controversies subsequently happening over his attempts to ban visas from certain Muslim countries. Issues of Russian interference in the electoral process, which in the last few hours have seen the sacking of the FBI chief, James Comey, with suggestions of a cover-up and talks of a possible Watergate-type scandal. This comes in a backdrop of bitter exchanges between the US and North Korea over missile launches. So we all wonder, how will these upheavals translate into global economic and investment performance? Assalamu alaikum, and Adam, and welcome to In Focus.
Wa alaikum salam, Carl, and to all the viewers out there.
Now, before we get into all the upheavals that I've spoken about in my introduction, I wonder if you could give us some sort of understanding of the progress of the fiscal readjustments that have been taking place over the last couple of years. I know we've just come out of a financial crisis when I was just talking to you last.
You know, the financial crisis is now nearly 10 years in the making. And, you know, the first part of the period post the financial crisis was to steady the ship, prevent it for, the global economy and certain local economies from really going into very substantial decline. And here we have to really say Barack Obama in particular did a fantastic job in stabilizing the ship, made some very dramatic changes shortly after he became president. A very dynamic first year, and that actually stabilized the global economy. Then you take that on a global perspective, you had general consensus from that period almost to a year ago, or shy of a year ago, where the G20 coordinated economic and environmental policy. Okay. So firstly, it was to stabilize the economy. So, and that was based on a couple of tenets. Governments, one, did exceptional monetary expansion. They started buying bonds and they started buying instruments to support, okay? And that's what's called quantitative easing. Now, America started that and it went to Japan, it went to UK and Europe. America exited that process about 3 years ago. And we hear that now that the French elections are behind us and the German, that Europe will most probably start the exiting process later this year. So that's Europe really healed from a from an exceptional point of view. Further, monetary policy, interest rates were cut down to nothing, and to stimulate the economy, and that meant that companies could borrow very cheaply, could invest. Those companies that had huge borrowings could pay less. So that again stabilized the economy. And that process again started by the US because of the proactivity of Barack Obama and his administration. They were most probably 18 months to 36 months ahead of the curve to start with the corrective process, and they started raising interest rates. And so monetary policy in place, then fiscal policy. You know, governments were spending so much more than they were earning before the financial crisis, and when the financial crisis came, their tax base declined, so the expenditure far exceeded their revenue. Okay, so they tried to raise a bit more taxes, they did some policy reform, but they had to go through, to stabilize the ship, they had to go through what we call austerity. And the worst examples of austerity, because it's still ongoing, would most probably be Greece and Iceland. And so even those austerities, so the beginning of 2016, end of 2015, the G20 said the global economy was now on a stable path, government finances were stabilized, we can now go on to normal fiscal policy. And so you started seeing government spending, and so economy starts picking up globally. The third element was that there was, over the last 20 years, but in particular the last 10 years, the focus on global trade, a trade of people and goods and services. So people could move between countries, so the best people could find jobs, and so that meant that global efficiency improved, the cheapest goods got to the end market, the global consumer, and that encouraged global expansion. And unfortunately, what it does is in all of these things, there are those people that win and those people that lose. Unfortunately, most of the losers were in the industrial heartland of the developed countries. So surprise, surprise, so now you've got this momentum of the global economy. Surprise, surprise, the people who left behind vote Brexit, they vote Trump, and they nearly, luckily, people saw the impact of Trump, and so the reversal, because you then had elections coming up in Holland, and at the time, Wilders was ahead of the curve, and he was going to walk the election. Le Pen was ahead of the curve towards the end of 2016.
Yeah.
And you know what? The proof in the pudding is when you elect a populace, like they elected in the West, there's some negative reaction.
Well, we're going to get on to the issue of the populism in a moment. But look, you've had a very thorough appraisal of this last period leading up to, say, the tail end of last year. But then we've seen some major volcanic eruptions at that point. And firstly, I'd like just to deal with what's going on in the United States and whether and to what degree that is going to impact on investment. All these upheavals. Donald Trump's first 100 days was announced just the week, and with only this morning, I think I mentioned he's just fired his FBI chief. There are suggestions there may be even another Watergate scandal and a cover-up. We've had suggestions of interference in the elections and a big spat between the United States and North Korea. How does that impact on global investment?
Obviously, if the news is negative, it impacts negatively because it impacts on confidence. So I'll come on to that in a minute. So what you had is this global expansion, and China. One thing about China, Barack Obama helped us out of the financial crisis with China.
Yeah.
And when the fiscal stimulus was proposed, the Chinese got out of their starting blocks at the end of 15, the beginning of 16, and they started spending. So that keeps the global economy rising. So that together with weakening currencies has meant that the pain of something like Brexit hasn't yet really hit the ballpark. And then Donald Trump comes in and he says, wow, he's going to spend money on infrastructure. That's fiscal stimulus. But a lot of that fiscal stimulus, so you've almost towards the end of 2016, there's a euphoria. The Chinese spending, the global economy picking up, and the new administration saying some of the right things about infrastructure. They say some of the right things about taxes, but they don't say how they're going to pay for it. Right? So they build up the market expectations. What has happened is most probably, so the market gives us a lot of euphoria. So financial markets post the election, despite all this uncertainty, has actually been very buoyant. Buoyant in places like the UK and Europe, because not only of the global expansion, but the declining currencies.
So what you're saying is the impact of all these headline stories are marginal.
No. You know, when Richard Nixon asked Mao Zedong, when they first met, to give the impact of the French Revolution, his assessment of the French Revolution, and this is a couple of 100 years later, and his comment was, it was too early to have an opinion and a final assessment of the French Revolution. So one must be very careful. These are long-term issues.
Yes.
So we have at the moment, so towards November and the inauguration in the US,
Yes.
you have the lead indicators shooting through the roof. So when there's austerity and low growth,
Yes.
then the bond market, the government bond market, the yields are very low. And immediately, within days of Donald Trump being elected, the yields shoot up from 220 to 290, and well on the way to 3.5%. Markets giving the talk 100% confidence. Okay? The 100 days has been the least productive 100 days. No legislation, okay? Lots of talk. Now the problem is, one of the first pieces of legislation that's come through is the healthcare bill, which needed tweaking, but the incoming administration built its case on replacing it. But replacing it has some consequences, including 30 million people who were brought into and they 30 million voters who were brought into the pond, and you just don't easily, that surprise, surprise, the Republicans voted that down. So, but the next move is the fiscal stimulus, lower taxes. That has to be paid somehow. And you don't stimulate an economy that's already into the 7th, 8th, 9th year of expansion. You know, you stimulate an economy that is like the financial crisis, that's on its knees, needs assistance, but it doesn't need assistance now. So you know, very recently, a couple of things. The bond market has gone from 290 to 230. The bond market's not believing the talk any longer. Okay? Secondly, some of the most renowned leaders in this whole environment were now retired, so they can speak, you know, freely. Alan Greenspan says maybe this is the wrong thing to be doing. And Ben Bernanke says maybe this is the wrong thing to be doing. So you're now seeing maybe the talk doesn't result in delivery. You don't walk the talk. You talk the talk, you don't, you know. And maybe some people start doubting. And therefore, maybe you actually get some reduction in confidence. And so maybe it's too short to be positive. You know, so financial markets have moved up very dramatically. It's been fantastic. We've been very cautious. We have the highest level of cash. We've taken profits where appropriate. We're looking for those companies that are undervalued. And so we're preparing for a situation that if we're not saying there's going to be repeat of the financial crisis, but we're preparing for increased volatility. We're preparing for lower confidence, because the market at the moment is assuming everything's going to be hunky-dory. That's the US.
Now, moving on from the US, here at home, here in the UK, we're 5 weeks away from another snap general election, which again, yet another surprise. There were a commitment to no election for 5 years, and then suddenly we've got one. Theresa May is predicted to win a landslide victory, almost unprecedented majority she's expected to have, with the main opposition party, the Labour Party, in total turmoil. And this all as she goes into Brexit negotiations, which have now been officially triggered, with the issues surrounding the free movement of people and goods, which I remember from our last conversation you said is crucially important for economic growth, now all up in the air Is it likely that big corporations, big business, significant components of the financial sector might end up moving their offices from the UK into mainland Europe?
So the economy and financial markets in the UK have exceeded expectations post-Brexit. You remember, I was actually in Medina at the time, in June last year when the election happened, and I woke up in the middle of the night, just to prepare for what's called Tahajjud, and then Fajr, and I switched on my telephone, and I couldn't believe it. The pound was down 10% or so, and the indicators were very materially down, and the market reacted very negatively. What hasn't happened now? Partly because that the global momentum that we spoke about, and partly because the depreciating pound. So what it's made more people come to the UK. Hotels are full. So where the pound gives you flexibility is because it's not tied to a whole string of like the euro. Greece doesn't have the same benefit of being able to weaken a currency. So the pound has weakened, it's stimulated the economy. We've just triggered Brexit, Article 50. And the consequences is that I don't think it's going to be a free ride. Okay? So two things that are happening. Slowly but surely, inflation has picked up. The consequences of a weaker currency is inflation. The consumer side is under pressure because people are concerned where they're going to have jobs, whether inflation's picking up. So the consumer side is slowing down. I would anticipate the investment side to slow down quite dramatically in this negotiation period, because while you're negotiating, while there's uncertainty, you defer and delay decisions, and alternatively, you start hedging your bets. So you start saying, okay, as a company, maybe I'll put up a small business or a small operation in Frankfurt or Luxembourg or Dublin, and we'll see how these negotiations go. If it goes well and I don't have to have it there, then it's a small cost. But if it goes badly, I can very quickly scale that up. And then the EU is now saying that, okay, all those EU-related, like Euro clearing, all those EU-related issues that happens in London needs to now be in an EU member country. So on the margin, I think the next 12, 18 months is a period of great uncertainty from a global perspective and from a UK perspective. And we need to be confident. We need to be very bullish to counter the negative sentiment. Because if we counter the negative sentiment, we can actually start making decisions and the economy keeps on even keel.
Now, you mentioned the word populism earlier on in your conversation. The world held its breath as elections were taking place in the Netherlands and then in France and Germany. There was, as you mentioned, Geert Wilders was strongly expected to gain prominence, and Le Pen managed to oust the mainstream parties from the final runoff. What are the implications, one of them having been finally thwarted, I suppose, at the gate, but the fact that they gained such a big numbers in the elections, does that have an impact on confidence?
It will have an impact on confidence because it impacts a couple of things. Firstly, the movement of goods and services. So if you look at it, the global economy, if it was growing at 3, or just simplistically, if the global economy was growing at 10, and before the financial crisis, global trade was growing at 1.5 times the global economy, so it was growing 15%. So it was stimulating growth. So you got the London Gateway ports and happening because we needed more ports for the goods and services that we needed to transport. Today, if the global economy is running at 10, global trade is running at half of that, so at 5. So global trade is actually slowing the global economy. You need less ports, you need less ships, you need less trains, and you need less handling of all the goods, and that has an effect of reducing. Then secondly, you're now seeing bans on laptops for certain airlines. Now, what happens is, so firstly on goods and service goods, the price goes up because you're now cutting supply. If you ban or you reduce the opportunity for the supply of aeroplanes to come into countries, the domestic players do well, but inflation, the cost of traveling goes up very materially. So the populism actually defeats and hurts the very people it's supposed to benefit, in the long
put it
run.
another way, the very people who have voted to bring it in.
Yes, and then populism, you know what? In smokestack America,
Yeah.
the chances of putting another coal mine, there's no coal, there's green energy, there's green, so you're not, those people are, coal is always lost. You need to re-engineer the jobs, you need to re-engineer the skills. So the two things, so we spoke about goods, we spoke about services, we now talk about people. So when something is made in China rather than Louisville, Kentucky or Ohio, the issue is the job is lost in Louisville, in Ohio, but China gains the job. So it's low-end jobs. But China buys Boeing aircraft, and Seattle gets the job. Okay? High-end jobs. So the problem is you need to train all, so it's not lost, it's just different places.
Shifted.
And so Seattle does well, but Ohio does poorly. So come along in election, Ohio now says no more of this trade because we want the jobs, but they're never going to get the jobs. So there's going to be lots of, they don't have the skills. You must remember, globalization's been going on for 20, 30 years. A lot of those skills have disappeared. A lot of the people are now in their 50s, 60s and 70s.
Now, I want to just quickly ask you whether what's going on in Turkey has any significance. I mean, there was a referendum, again, big headlines and spats between European countries and the President Erdogan. But he's now changing the constitution. He's now, everybody says, given himself more power. Some have even suggested that he's moving towards a dictatorship, although quite simply what he seems to have done is mirror what's gone on in France and in America. How will all this, these changes affect trade and investment?
So, if you look at the constitution that Turkey had, it was an outdated, oppressive constitution where the majority was oppressed by the minority. The majority had no freedom. The minority had rights, but the majority had no rights. The majority's behavior was constitutionally determined without the same constraints on the minority. So it was effective a version of apartheid. It was designed for minority rule. And you then had many levers to impact that. The military head could just decide on a coup d'etat, and we've had many of those. And that's not good for economic growth, it's not good for wealth. You had the head of the judiciary who could fire the president at a woman fancy. Not the election, not the vote, but all these extraneous, non-democratic institutions could overpower democracy. So I fail to understand how a constitution that promotes democracy and counters all these kind of undemocratic processes is actually dictatorial. And, Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 2 million people. But he's president. elections. You just need to win by one vote
Yes.
or one electoral college. That's all.
Yes.
That's the democratic process.
Exactly.
So, we've got to be fair and say democracy has worked. The majority have voted to change constitution.
Yeah.
The election has been deemed to be free and fair. And so I actually think, what does it do? It reduces the risk on undemocratic removal of governments.
Which he's just almost faced a few months before.
Exactly. And you know what? If you have a coup d'etat, France is still in a state of emergency because all of these horrible terror attacks, horrible, okay? Still a state of emergency. Here you had almost a toppling of a government. And so there has to be state of emergency, so I actually think what the end result of this is actually a lower risk of extraneous changes in government, greater degree of certainty, greater democracy, greater freedom, greater social integration. Now imagine Turkey is in the most difficult part of the world, in having the most difficult circumstances, terror, neighbors at war, or coup d'etat, it's still growing at 2 and 3%. And can you imagine if the potential of an undemocratic process, Turkey has the opportunity to sustainably grow because of its integration with some of its neighbors and long-term integration with neighbors to grow between 5 and 7% long-term. And
now,
that's a good growth story.
Now we're sadly short on time, and I just wanted to ask you about the significance of the publication earlier this year of the World Bank Group and Islamic Development Bank Global Report on Islamic Finance. They were recommending a range of intervention programs. They were saying that there need to be more regulation on banks, there need to be a promotion of the sukuks and capital investments in Islamic capital investments. How big was that move? Will it mean anything?
I think you always have developments, but Islamic finance has been growing phenomenally. And it's been doing that, and there will always be tweaking of any regulation, of any framework. But I don't think there needs to be radical change. We've just seen the biggest sukuk ever issued. And they issued, I think, 8 billion. It's not a small sukuk. It's big by global bond standards. And there was demand between 30 and 40 billion for that 8 billion. So they could have easily issued double the 8 billion, and the demand would have still been there, and the pricing has been there. So you've got the market deepening in size. It's deepening in the number of issuers. Saudi Arabia now for the first time sovereign issued sukuk. We've had the UK issue the sukuk. You've had Hong Kong issue sukuk. And now Hong Kong's become a repeat issue of sukuks. So what you really want to see is not only the first issuer, but you want to see repeat issuers by sovereigns, and then you want to see the deepening of the sukuk market into the corporate space, whether it's the banking institutions or industrial or other institutions. So I actually think that all of these things are just a continuum of making the market more efficient, protecting investors, lowering costs, and making sure we are able to deliver on this untapped, the real opportunity. And that's why we're here.
So Adam, as we bring our conversation to a close, it would be a bit remiss of me not to find out from you how Oasis has been doing. I mean, in our last meeting, you said it was precisely at times of crisis like these that Oasis funds tend to outperform its peers. Often, you said, dramatically. You've emphasised the importance of sticking to the fundamentals of your group's philosophy. Can you give me a quick outline of what those are, and perhaps an insight into how the funds have been doing in the last 9-10 months since we spoke?
So as we chatted through most of this chat, we haven't had the negative effect of all the risk and things like that. So the market hasn't been down, it's actually been buoyant. So it's not been a crisis. In fact, if you had predictive what would happen at Brexit to now, it's almost the opposite. And that's the beauty of financial markets, and that's the beauty of analytics. And so our funds have done well, and our clients have done well. We have two sets of funds, the global funds that you can get in pounds, and the domestic funds that are pound denominated. So they kind of, I'll start off with the domestic funds. The domestic funds have done well in relation to the UK economy and in relation to the UK market. Okay? But the global funds denominated in pounds have done incredibly well because the global economy has grown faster than the UK economy. And secondly, you've got the benefit of the depreciating currency. So many of our global funds denominated in pounds are up 20%. So people's wealth have been protected from the depreciation in the pound. And the domestic pound-based funds have done not as well because of the, you don't get the full effect of the currency, but they've also done reasonably well. It's given us the opportunity to cherry pick one or two opportunities. So the portfolio, we think, is well positioned. If the going is good, like it's been over the last 12 months, despite the noise, we will do okay. But if some of the issues that we spoke about, China's slowing down, maybe talk doesn't turn into delivery, our funds are incredibly well positioned if there's any downward pressure. So we've got the most cash that we've ever had in 16 years in our funds. The market's gone up. When the markets go up, we sell and we take our profits. And when the markets are down, we buy. And just think of that. And that's what we should be making over the long run if we stick to our guns. And that's the philosophy. That's a discipline. So this is about focusing on 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I'm going to invoke the Mao comment that the effect of Brexit and Trump, it's far too early. Our portfolios are well positioned. We're cautious. We're hungry. We're determined. We're focused. And we're passionate about serving our clients and our community.
Well, on that very profound note, I suppose our viewers should be ordering immediately the Oasis Red Book with those notes. Adam Ibrahim, CEO Oasis Crescent, it's been, as always, a real pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us on Islam Channel.
Carl, thank you so much. And to the viewers, thank you for listening. And wish you everything of the best with the run-up to Ramadan.